Good morning. My name is Kim Esther. I work for a particular project in the Displacement of the money. Good morning. My name is September Olga, SCPG assistant, working under the government facility program of a particular project. Good morning, everyone. My name is Joanna Luna. I am project officer based in Lamont Field Office in Particular Project. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Jennifer Duco. I'm a project assistant in Kandongo Refugee Settlement. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Joanna Yola. I work with the Gender and Sexuality Program here in Kampala. Thank you.
I'm called the Team Party, Video Advocacy Manager based in Kampala, Refugee Project. Morning, everyone. The Team Party is my name. I work with the Refugee Project under the program called Media Project Exchange. Morning, everyone. I'm Waharaj Modi, part of the Refugee Project.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Lydia Asina. I work with Refugee Project as the field office coordinator of Mara Office. Good morning, everyone. My name is Tasha Katanda, and I work as a legal officer with the Refugee Project and the Black Justice Program.
My name is Samanda, work with India. Thank you so much, everybody. I'm sure some people, as they're working, may not have this opportunity anymore. As you can see clearly, we have people from the government, representing government of Uganda. We have people from representation from Uganda Police Force. They've been here with us very soon. Uganda Prison Service, Director of Immigration is here with us. UPDF will be joining. Ministry of Gender, Labour and Social Development, Ministry of Health, OPM, jailers. They will be here with us in the space. We also have UNHCR and UN other agencies also joining us. And we have our partners that we've been working with for a very long period of time in and out of Uganda. And with us, we also have survivors representing others, and they're from all over Uganda. We hope that this meeting will allow us to talk into issues which to some people it's a very difficult conversation, but we still believe, and our theory is, if you work on issues of sexual violence, we attribute it to going in the kitchen cooking. If you can't stand the smoke, if you can't stand the heat, you might as well not call yourself a chef. So in the course of our deliberations, we might be hearing very painful stories. We hope you will have time to hear. And like Mary said, if you need somebody to talk to the gathering, we have prepared a space. And I would request the counselors assigned to stand up so that people can see, Mary's there, Francie. Maybe we could just come in front, just so that we know who to go to. And as they walk in front, we might be able to notice that there are different colors of t-shirts in the space. A few people with orange, balance for better. I know that's the color that has been guiding us since the year began. Yeah, so Mogi Wakaraj is on my right hand side, Mogi. And then Francis is up in the middle, and Mary Campogo. So these are our seasoned counselors in the space. Others should have been here, but they also have other tasks to do, but these have been assigned to talk to whoever we need somebody to talk to at any one time. And thank you so much. And if you see anybody wearing orange, like myself, Chris and Adam, those have been labeled day managers. And the day managers are supposed to see that your life is okay. If you need to see a doctor, you need any first aid kit, Adam is the type. He'll be able to help. And myself, Juliet, is today to be in orange. And Jackson, we try to see that our gathering here is the same time for time, meals, and everything. And if you see anybody in blue, blue is the staff of the Refugee Project, in case you have any questions. And we do not want to discriminate with color, but we try to be color sensitive. So for all the invited participants, we'll take grey. We hope you will bear with us. All the t-shirts will come to your table at some point. Next question. That is very kind. And fair enough, I think we will talk to Mary so that we take it to the space which has been prepared. So certainly, and if you need to volunteer any support, please do let us know. I think at this point, to also note that we have NBS that will be projecting us live at some point. but they will start with interviews outside the room. So at some point you might be seeing tips on your table that NBS is here, so do not be worried. I think at this point, I think we have Yuni sharing the space. Maybe we'll ask maybe the last one to introduce.
Good morning. My name is Louise Obama, Senior Protection Officer UNHCR.
Good morning. My name is Megan. I work with UNHCR with Congress. Thank you so much. And for our participants in the space, we've been working very closely with UNHCR to see that not just the protection of refugees in general, but to provide specialized support as and when required, including for survivors in the space. I'm sure their presence here means a lot for all of us and will help us in the deliberation. Now take this time to welcome the director to be able to welcome the principal school of law. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. Once again, my name is Chris Darwin. I'm Director of Refugee Law Project. In my spare time, I'm also a visiting professor at Ulster University, so I don't have much spare time. Very pleased to welcome representatives of the Office of the Prime Minister,
and the Principal School of Law, you're all most welcome. I just want to say that from the introductions, you can see what a very diverse group of people we have in the room today. I hope many of us tomorrow, Wednesday as well. Not everybody can stay for the full 3 days, but I really request for everyone who is here, let us be very respectful of each other. As I said, we talked about photographs. We do not allow photographs apart from the official team that was introduced already. And we equally don't allow any videoing. And we say we don't allow, that sounds very controlling. But I think you can understand there are good reasons for that, given the sensitivity of the issues that we're discussing. And you should also know that this is an invitation-only event. There are many other people who wanted to come. Some of them we couldn't take because of space and budget. Others we did not follow up because we were not sure whether or not they would be comfortable in this environment and in these engagements. So everybody that is in this room, we have a hope and a trust. As Onen said, can take the heat in the kitchen and is comfortable with that heat and respectful of everybody else who is in the kitchen. As you know, Refugee Law Project is not an NGO. Some people think we are because our offices are a little outside the main campus. And sometimes we do this kind of thing which looks like we're an NGO doing a campaign of having t-shirts and the like, but we're not a non-governmental organization. We're actually an outreach project of the School of Law, Makerere University, which is a very different institutional framework. And it's a framework created by the Tertiary Institutions Act. And as an outreach project, our motivations are also slightly different from your average NGO. So we do direct service provision, but we don't stop there. We also link that to our research work, and we link all of that to advocacy. So as well as trying to be the change we want to see, but we're also trying to bring about broader changes through the combination of direct work and using that experience to inform other discussions. none of that is possible if we did not have a very sound, solid, safe home in the School of Law. And I must say, having been in this position since 2006, we've been through good times and bad times, and the School of Law really has been a safe haven throughout all of that period. And so it gives me great pleasure to invite the principal of the School of Law, Dr. Kristen Bazira, to come and give us our welcoming remarks and kickstart this conversation today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Dolan. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. As introduced, I'm the principal of the School of Law, Makerere. I was given a grey t-shirt. I think I should have had an orange t-shirt because I'm your host, meaning your welfare is my business. It's actually an obligation. Welcome to Kampala, welcome to Uganda, but mainly welcome to the School of Law, Makerere University. A special welcome to our guests that have come from different countries. I was looking at or listening to the introductions. People have come from different parts of the world. I know it's an expression of the closer collaboration you have with the Refugee Law Project that you traveled all the way. And a special thanks to the various partners that have been behind this institute, the fourth phase now, or fourth season. Thank you so much for supporting the School of Law. Special thanks to Male Survivors of Sexual Abuse Trust, First Step Cambodia, and other partners that are in the room, including those that have supported the process financially, technically, and otherwise. It's always a great pleasure to have events of this nature, spearheaded by the Refugee Law Project. As Dr. Dolan has said, the Refugee Law Project is part of the School of Law, although sometimes many people think it's not part of the School of Law because of its physical location, but also because of the great things that it does. I would like to specifically thank Dr. Dolan for the leadership you provided. The Refugee Law Project, as you said, it has been through a lot of recent. We know that in the last probably 8 years, there has been a consistent attack on the civic space in Uganda. It has become a global phenomenon. The Refugee Law Project in Uganda has not been spared from that attack, but it has fought on using the safe haven of the School of Law, which the School of Law is proud of and ready to provide consistently. I would also like to thank the Refugee Law Project for two things. One is the consistency. The second is the courage. With respect to consistency, the Refugee Law Project has been consistent, working on issues that touch on conflict, working on issues that touch on forced migration and refugees. But it has also had the courage to tackle issues that are so sensitive, or issues that so many persons working in this area would rather not speak about, including the subject of this institute. And surely that's what academic outfits are supposed to do, to have that courage to tackle very sensitive but yet pertinent issues in society. So I thank the Refugee Law Project for consistently tackling the subject of sexual violence against men in the context of conflict. We know that sexual violence in itself is a very complex issue, but it even becomes more complex if you speak of sexual violence against men. And I understand the complexity and sensitivity, which is the reason we are told not to film and take photographs, because it's a sensitive matter. So I thank Refugee Law Project for confronting this complex issue. I also thank Refugee Law Project and the partners for giving this institute both the regional and international context, but also doing it in a manner that promotes regional and international collaboration. Surely the problems that we faced in Uganda, the problems that we faced in the Great Lakes region are not unique to the country, are not unique to the region, but they are global problems. Violence against men in the context of conflict is also a global problem. So we cannot fully unpack the problem and find solutions as well as address the needs of survivors and victims without having that regional and international context. So I thank Refugee Law Project for consistently having that promoting the international collaboration. Also in a special way, I would like to welcome the keynote speaker. By the way, she's coming to the school for the second time. I don't know whether the Refugee Law Project knew that. She first came as the keynote speaker again at a public lecture. It has been, I think, was it 2013? Yes, I think it was 2013. So we thank you for loving the School of Law. We thank you for, again, also at your individual and level, but also as an expert for working consistently on the subject of sexual violence. I'm not going to say much. I think I've already said enough. Otherwise, I wish you the best. Maybe to welcome you to School of Law, but also to Makerere. Please, when you have free time, find time to walk. It's actually walkable distance. To come and visit the School of Law, visit Makerere University. It's the oldest university in the country. There is quite a lot to see. Yes, our students are right now writing exams, but so many places are open for you to see. And if you need any help, please, I'm available. The school is not so far, and I will be glad to provide any help that you may need. Thank you so much, and wish you the best.
I think he's well deserving of the orange t-shirt. I'll request Dr. Chris to hand it over.
Is it the next
I think as a bonus, I'll request Jackson to come and take over for this session.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here this morning, surrounded by two great professors. So you can imagine my climate here. And a lot of climate change will be moving around this room. And I'm happy that in the course of the next 2-3 days, we'll be able to unpack the theme of this wonderful institute. Thank you, Professor Christopher Mbazira. By the way, for your own information, he did say that Makerere is the oldest institution, but it's also the third largest. And I think set up in 1960-something, 62. So you can imagine how many years that is in terms of generations. And not only is it an institution, but it's produced presidents. Okay? So it is that wonderful institution that when you come amidst people around it, you feel the atmosphere. The real climate change you feel, if it is hot here, it's cooler, for that matter. Without wasting much time, I would like to invite Professor Chris Dolan, who is also the director of the Refugee Law Project. And like we said, Refugee Law Project is an outreach organ of the School of Law. So we are actually Makerere University. So we are proud to be part of this history. But also for you to note that this year is RLP's birth year. So RLP is celebrating its 20 years of existence, and that's why you have 20 somewhere, almost everywhere that you'll see, and you'll continue to see in the course of this year. And already you informed that Professor Chris is a visiting professor at Ulster University. He's also a very distinguished practitioner, an academist, and a scholar on conflict-related violence. Dr. Chris, you're welcome.
Thank you very much, Jackson. I think I should stand. Thanks, Jackson, and thank you again to our principal for welcoming us to this, for being our overall host for this event. On behalf of Refugee Law Project as the immediate day-to-day host, but also on behalf of the two organizations that co-founded the South-South Institute on Sexual Violence Against Men and Boys. And those two organizations are an organization called first step, Cambodia, which, as the name tells you, is in Cambodia. And male survivors, Ken will tell us how to pronounce that properly, but from New Zealand. So those are the two organizations with whom we got the courage together to put together the first South Institute back in 2012. 2013, I beg your pardon. But we're really privileged that you're giving your valuable time and your energy to us in tackling our theme this year, namely bridging the sexual violence, torture divide. So in my remarks this morning, which will not take so long, thankfully the PowerPoint failed, so I can't project a PowerPoint, I will just talk. But in my remarks, I want to tackle three major areas. Firstly, give you some background to this institute and where things were at with regard to conflict-related sexual violence in general, sexual violence against men in particular, back when we set up the institute. Secondly, I want to try and give you a very summarized reading of where I think things are at in the discussion about sexual violence and conflict today in 2019. And then I want to look at some of the, what do we mean by the major questions relating to the sexual violence, torture divide, and why did we make that our particular theme for the next 3 days. In terms of where we came from, it all started with a piece in The Guardian, which is a British daily newspaper. And that piece was called something like The Rape of Men, The Darkest Secret, something like that, in 2011. And it was written by a journalist called Will Storr, who actually came to Uganda and spent about 2-3 weeks with us and with some of the men that we were working with at that time. And then he wrote about it and he published it, and as well as himself winning a big award for his investigative journalism, he told me subsequently that article online received one of the largest number of hits of any article that The Guardian had ever published. So it kind of tells you a lot about how this is a topic which is very little spoken about, very little written about, but there's a huge level of interest and a huge level of people that want to know more and want to understand more. And I can kind of personally confirm that so many individuals have come to me and said, we first heard about this through reading that article. And because of that article, I changed the topic of my thesis. Because of that article, I changed the way that we're working in my organization. And so it's a great example of how good journalism, and I'm really glad that JJ Wangui is here, which is another great journalist, but good journalism can change the narrative and open people's eyes to things that maybe they're not thinking about otherwise. One of the many people who read that piece was a gentleman called Alistair Hilton, who is known to some of us in the room. Unfortunately, could not make it to this particular institute, as in all the others. But after reading the piece, he called me. Somehow he got hold of me through Skype. He called. I was a bit worried, like, who is this guy? What does he want to know? But we talked, and it turned out we were going to be in New York, not New Zealand, New York, at the same time in November 2012. So we agreed we would meet and swap notes. And indeed we met, and at the same time we met with Ken Clearwater, who I think right now is being interviewed outside somewhere, from New Zealand. And we were in a conference which was about male survivors, and it was in the middle of New York City. And all the participants seemed to be either survivors or their therapists. And the discussion was really about how do therapists and survivors interact and what is the best path to healing for the individual survivor there was no discussion about the bigger picture, about what are the dynamics that bring about these kinds of abuse, these kinds of violence. And we kind of felt from our different working experiences, whether here working with refugees from all across the region, whether in Cambodia, working in a post-conflict setting, whether in New Zealand, which is, I never quite dare to call it a post-colonial setting, but another setting with a lot of history. You know, we felt that the conversations in that conference were not really the ones that would help to make progress on the issue. They would not generate movement. And we felt that there are issues in childhood sexual abuse that are completely different to the issues arising for adult men who get sexually violated. When they're already adults, they're often already married, they often have children, and it creates a whole bunch of different dynamics. Not necessarily worse, not necessarily better, but different dynamics to what happens when boys are abused in peacetime, in homes and in their own homes. So we felt there has to be a different conversation. We could see that there were actually, even in that conference, there were some people who were trying to say, let's set up the international discussion, and we were like, this is not going to work because they're coming from the wrong angle, the wrong direction. And that's really where the impulse came from. When you look at the discussion, the discourse, the practice on conflict-related sexual violence at that time, this was back in 2012, you could see things were moving. Following on from one of the UN Security Council resolutions, I think it was 1880, there was the office of the Special Representative of the Secretary General of the United Nations on Sexual Violence and Conflict was established in 2010. Where located? Guess New York. So that office was established 2010 with Margot Wallström was the first special representative. Similar time, William Hague, who at that time was Foreign Secretary for the British government, this was before the British government tore itself to pieces with Brexit. At that time they were a bit more coherent, and he was the Foreign Secretary, and he was working closely with Angelina Jolie, and they teamed up to push what was then and is still known as the PSVI, the Prevention of Sexual Violence Initiative, which was going to lead to a big global summit in London in mid-2014. And that was also an event at which the first edition of what is now known as the International Protocol on the documentation and investigation of sexual violence was to be launched. So you can see, this is now 7-8 years ago. There was a lot going on at the so-called global level, which basically means London, New York, and Geneva sometimes. But when you look more closely, and we were looking much more closely because we were on the ground, it was really evident that 99% of the research, the policy, the practice, and the discourse was focused on sexual violence as it affects women and girls, with barely a mention of men and boys. At that time, there was only one document from international organizations guiding work with male victims of conflict-related sexual violence, namely the UNHCR, United Nations High Commission for Refugees, Need to Know Guidance Note, which was actually written jointly with the Refugee Law Project. Something called the Interagency Standing Committee, which is basically a collection of the major humanitarian agencies that we all know, people like Oxfam and IRC and so on. They had developed guidelines a few years earlier in 2005 on gender-based violence in humanitarian settings. And if you read just the first page, it says this is about women and girls. There was nothing in there. At that time, it was about 100 pages long. And it said nothing at all about how humanitarian agencies should go about working with men and boys. In the global summit that happened in 2014, which refugee law project was represented by Onen and myself, there was what they called, I can't remember the name they gave it, but there was a space for civil society organizations to present their work. There were more than 100 organizations, and there was only one talking about sexual violence against men and boys, and that was us. So we were less than 1% of the organizations present. So that gives you a sense of where things were at 6 or 7 years ago. So we moved quickly after meeting in November 2012. In April 2013, we convened the first South-South Institute on Sexual Violence Against Men and Boys in Conflict and Displacement, with the theme, Inclusive Responses to Sexual and Gender-Based Violence. And it was held in this very hall. So we were actually in this exact space 6 years ago, almost to the, not quite to the day, 6 years and a month. We were in this hall, and I'm happy to say that there are a number of participants with us today who were also here 6 years ago. And we discussed many issues, including, we were trying to say what is our agenda when we talk about male survivors. We discussed provision of appropriate medical and psychosocial support. We discussed building movements of survivors. We discussed redressing community shame from self-destruction to reconstruction. And we talked about developing legal frameworks that allow male victims to seek redress and justice. And the findings from that first South-South Institute actually helped to inform what then became the first meeting organized by the Special Representative and Secretary General, who by then was Ms. Zainab Bangura, in New York in August 2013. I say it was the first meeting organized by the SRSG SVC. I can also tell you it was the last. There was a lot of pushback from various groupings, some of whom said they were feminists, and many of whom felt that we were taking attention away from the women and girls discussion, even though we were less than 1% of it, but we were taking away attention. And the SRSG's office should have nothing to do with such a dilution of focus. But I'm happy also to say that at that meeting, a couple of our participants here today, Thomas Osorio, Ken Clearwater, Onen David, myself, were in that meeting. Following that, Alistair Hilton, who, as I say, is not here today, but is with us in spirit and busy on Facebook, and First Step Cambodia convened a very successful second South-South Institute in Phnom Penh, in Cambodia. And that's an environment many of you may not be so familiar with, but under Pol Pot, under the Khmer Rouge, there was quite a lot of torture. Let me say what we know from the torture, it's been kind of framed under that traditional heading of torture. There was also a lot of forced marriage, but a lot of the attention has been on the women who were forced into marriages rather than the men. So that was part of our discussion in Cambodia. What about the men? Many of them were monks, and the Khmer Rouge didn't believe in their religion, and so it dragged them out of their religious spaces and forced them to get married. So you could imagine what kind of issues that brought for those men as well as for the women. And our topic there was, or our theme, was addressing the long shadow. Because it was not a conflict situation, it was a post-conflict situation, we started to look at what does it mean if we leave that kind of sexual violence done to men and boys unaddressed. What kind of a shadow does it cast on their futures, as well as on the futures of their families, their children, and society more broadly. And we took that discussion even further in the third South-South Institute, which was held in Christchurch, New Zealand, under the leadership of Ken Clearwater. In New Zealand, I don't have the detailed figures at my fingertips, but I remember we were given evidence in the institute that suggests that the Maori boys, the Maoris are what we call the indigenous people of New Zealand, not the settlers, not the white settlers. The Maori boys are more impacted by sexual abuse and sexual violence than descendants of the white settlers. And so we learn in thinking about which men and boys are victimized. We can't ignore those kind of key power dynamics, the ways in which gender is not the only power dynamic, it's gender which intersects with race and with particular political histories. And we have to see those interconnections if we're to understand where sexual violence and abuse is more likely to come from and more likely to target. And if you think that issues of race are not important in New Zealand, I think the recent shootings of Muslims, 90% of them adult men at prayer in a mosque, in the very same city where we held the South Institute, should make you think again. We had already felt it in 2017 when both Onen and Emed were denied visas to go to New Zealand, despite their clear track records on the issues which we were going to speak to. And it was partly because of that racism that we decided that the 2017 Institute, we have to bring it back to Kampala, and we have to refocus on conflict-related sexual violence, and we have to look at where are we now. So that's a fairly detailed history of where the South Institute came from. But I think an important history, because all of this is, in a way, what we're doing is stories. We're building a story, and it's the storytelling that builds the momentum and helps people to understand what are we talking about. It's not all about statistics. In terms of where we're at now, things have changed. About a month ago, the UN Security Council passed its latest resolution as part of the series on women, peace and security. So UN Security Council Resolution 2467. And that is the first of a whole series of resolutions that actually recognizes male survivors of sexual violence as existing at all and as needing support. If you look at all the previous ones from 1325 up to 2467, there is no mention of male survivors or male victims, direct victims of sexual violence. There's one reference, I think it was 2106, to men and boys as secondary victims, because they might have seen somebody else getting raped. So 2467 actually represents, in that respect, a really big leap forward. Let me not call it a leap, a little step forward, much though the resolution is not great in other respects. It took out sexual and reproductive health rights. They were there and they got taken out by the United States of America. Apparently, it's okay to recognize that people can be victims of sexual violence, but not okay to recognize that they have reproductive health rights and needs. So there are some funny things about that resolution. But at least what we have is that very high-level statement that men can be victims of sexual violence. However, the Office of the Special Representative, Secretary General on Sexual Violence and Conflict, issued a press statement which is almost entirely focused on rape. And that sort of brings up a whole challenge that we face, and which this institute, I hope, will help to tackle, which is that the discussion about sexual violence has been largely focused not just on women and girls, but on rape as the form of sexual violence that we should be paying attention to. And first of all, we've done a lot of work over the last 7 or 8 years to understand that rape can actually take many forms. And thankfully, this is recognized in the Rome Statute. But what we have increasingly also realized is is that if we just focus on rape, we're missing a very, very significant, major part of sexual violence as it affects men. And don't be surprised if this kind of discussion leads us to rethink what kind of sexual violence affects women. And we find that we've also been missing a lot of sexual violence against women because it was not necessarily rape. So that gap and that assumption that, okay, we can talk about sexual violence when we talk about rape, brings me to where are we at now? And I want to say in terms of the broad discussion, much though things have moved on in some respects, in other respects I think we're not very much further than we were 6 years ago at a global level. And why do I say that? I want to give you 5 reasons. First of all, our understanding of forms, as exemplified by our lack of understanding that sexual violence is much more than rape, is completely inadequate. There are so many other forms that sexual violence can take, and we do not recognize them. And so a lot is being missed. And I think that in the keynote we may get more examples, but just to get you thinking, maybe it's good I don't have the slides. Other forms, they can include things like being forced to strip naked in front of all sorts of people. They can include being forced to witness other people being raped. They can include having your genitals battered with all sorts of different objects, having them slammed shut in a drawer, in the chest of drawers, having your genitals tied up with pieces of string, burnt with cigarettes, shocked with electric cables. The list just goes on and on and on. In 2012, I gave a presentation where I listed 11 different forms that I had seen in the course of our work up to that point. I think the list now is probably more like 50. And I know that in the course of these 3 days, we're going to make that list even longer. Because we have people in the room for the first time from many different contexts, not just from this East African region and the Great Lakes sub-region. And I can guarantee you that they will bring other examples of forms of sexual violence that we've never heard about here in the Great Lakes region. And they will also go away from here having heard about things that they have never come across in the Balkans, Sri Lanka, Malawi. I think you're going to speak to Malawi, and so on. So that's on forms. We do not have a comprehensive understanding of forms of sexual violence at a global level. We have even less understanding of the logics of sexual violence. Is rape about sex? You know, there's that old slogan, rape is not about sex, it's about power. But somehow that slogan doesn't apply to men. So if it's not about power, does that mean that rape is about, and sexual violence is about sex for men? I think many people would say it's not. Sometimes it may be, but very often it's not. It's about other forms of exercising power, and violence, and humiliation, and control. Others would take you into discussions about, it's not even what to do with logic, it's not to do with intent, it's about coercion. We have many examples of men who have been coerced to commit what looks like sexual violence against others, but they're actually the victims of the sexual violence themselves. So the logics question is a funny question. And like I said on TV this morning, there's something really illogical about the way that we think about sexual violence. When we think about physical violence, we look for the evidence that physical violence was done. If you say, oh, this person's a victim of physical violence, look at the broken leg, or look at the bruise. So we point to the evidence. When we talk about psychological violence, this person is a victim of psychological violence. Can't you see they have insomnia? Can't you see they're depressed? Let's give them, I forgot what they call those questions. We can take them through a set of questions. Turns out they're depressed. So we know they've been victims of psychological violence. But when we talk about sexual violence, instead of looking at what are the impacts and how do we measure the impacts, what are the equivalents of the broken leg, the bruise, the depression, the insomnia, we're so obsessed with that. So was there some sex involved in sexual violence? Who was getting turned on? Who was having sexual pleasure? And I just wonder, why are we so illogical? Why do we measure physical violence and psychological violence by its impact, and we try to pretend that we can understand sexual violence in terms of intention? It's a total nonsense. And we have to start reading sexual violence from its impact. And when you start reading sexual violence from its impact, what kind of impact are you going to look at? You're going to look at the sexual impact. And the sexual impacts of what I would call now sexual violence against men they're not so surprising. They are very often seen in terms of sexual dysfunction, difficulties with completing sexual acts, difficulties with establishing and maintaining intimacy, intimate relationships, difficulties fathering children. And then going further, you can read the impacts back from social impacts, not just fathering the children, but then parenting those children. Not just having sex with your wife, but having a good relationship with your wife. So, there are many different ways in which we can read from the impact back to the sexual violence. And we have to begin that discussion about what are the impacts, or what can be seen as impacts of sexual violence, which allow us to then say, reading backwards, that was sexual violence. So the person who came with the cigarette and burned somebody all over the testicles was committing sexual violence. He may not have undressed at all. He may actually not have, he as the perpetrator may or she may have had no sexual pleasure whatsoever in that harm that was done to that particular body. And it's an important point because maybe Yasmin will refer to it and JJ should speak to it. We had a ruling from the ICC that cutting off somebody's genitals was not sexual violence. It was inhumane treatment. But I think try telling that to those men who no longer have, literally they no longer have the physical capacity to express their sexuality. Tell them that they're not victims of sexual violence. I'm sure that if they were still laughing about anything, they would laugh about that. So the logics, it's really, I would call it a dead-end pursuit of the logics of sexual violence. And I think we're also a bit lost in terms of what are our perspectives. Again, the UN Security Council resolution said we should have survivor-centered approaches. But they don't even recognize fully, and most people don't recognize fully who are the survivors. So how can we be survivor-centered if we don't even believe that they are survivors? So we have a long way to go there in terms of clarifying perspectives. Even more fundamentally, if we don't understand the forms, we're completely illogical ourselves and we don't understand the logics of sexual violence. How do we ask the right questions? If we cannot ask the right questions, we're never going to get the right evidence base. And we do not have the evidence at the moment. And the people who say women and girls are disproportionately affected, they are so unacademic and so wrong in terms of their understanding of what is evidence. And they're taking us all in what I think is a very wrong direction. Because what they're using as evidence is actually their information about those women that they have worked with. And because they haven't worked with any men, they say women are the the majority of cases. We have to be careful that, like, counting the people we've worked with as if they represented all the people of concern. We have to be careful not to do that. It's such a major, major error. And I'm kind of shocked at how many academics don't pick that up and don't just question the basic statistics on which those kind of arguments are made. But it's because we can't ask the right questions. And if we use the wrong language, we say, oh, it's a man, so whatever happened to him is torture. It's a woman, whatever happened to her is rape or sexual violence. We end up miscounting. So we count a lot of torture, but it generates a completely different response than if we count it as sexual violence. So we have to really think about, what are the forms that we're going to put under sexual violence? What are we going to consider as sexual violence? How are we going to count that? So that we have a better, more comprehensive picture. Because at the moment, we just do not have the real picture. We do not. And, the fifth overall problem with this whole discourse is, if you haven't got the real picture, how can you properly respond? I think all of us, we understand that when we go to the doctor, they need to actually know the symptoms, right? They need to know how high is your temperature, how big is the swelling, how many days have you had a running stomach before they can prescribe the medicine. But in the sexual violence field, it's like we're prescribing the medicine without having done any proper diagnosis. And if you cannot identify the problem really, how on earth can you talk about preventing it? If I don't know where your running stomach came from, how am I going to solve that problem? If I don't know where the sexual violence came from, how am I going to solve the problem with sexual violence? How am I going to prevent it? So, I think, and also, if you cannot prevent it, you cannot respond to it, how are you going to change the norms that probably do underpin it? There's a lot of people in the sexual violence field who say we have a social change agenda around gender norms. But they're missing half the discussion about the gender norms that produce and how gender norms produce sexual violence against all bodies, whether they are male bodies or female bodies or others. So that brings me to my third part, which will be quite short, but it's because you've read it mostly in the concept note already. So why have we brought this theme of bridging the sexual violence torture divide? And I hope that what I've explained makes it more evident that probably a lot of what should be described as sexual violence is being hidden under the term torture. And because it's hidden under the term torture, it does not get counted, it does not get recognized. Because it does not get recognized, there is no response to it. And even if there is some response, it cannot go far enough because the dynamics around non-sexual torture may well be quite different to the dynamics arising from sexualized violence and sexualized torture. And what we've seen in recent years, and one of the reasons I'm so particularly happy that Yasmin is here to speak with us, is that those that are looking critically are starting to see that a lot of what happens under torture is actually sexual violence. And I was privileged to work on a report for Yasmin's organization, the International Justice and Truth Project. And the report was called Unsilenced. And that report built on testimonies of roughly 250 men who were generally described as having been tortured. But when he read the testimonies, he realized that actually it was an incredible range of sexual violence, some of which included sexual acts, such as penetrative rape by guards and prison wardens and so on, others of which included physical violence, such as crushing testicles in chest of drawers and so on, sticking tubes up people's anuses, then putting barbed wire in and then withdrawing the tube so that the barbed wire stays there. Maybe Yasmin will give us more details, but just horrendous range. But it was very clear that those men were all Tamils. And in being arrested by the authorities, it was always because they were Tamils, and they were always suspected of having been part of the Tamil Tigers. So the rebels in Sri Lanka under the war, which had ended years ago, not so many years ago, but the war was over officially. So that report really kind of brought home that we have to recognize that what happened was sexual violence, and it was conflict related, even if the conflict was officially over. I think Dr. Yahya will speak to the work of lawyers and physicians for human rights in Turkey, working with Syrians, not just in Turkey. I think there's a network of medics around the region. And again, very much of what is happening against Syrian men is happening under that heading of torture. But he will tell us what does that actually look like. And I think we'll end up agreeing in the next couple of days that that torture is actually sexual violence. In our own work here as Refugee Law Project, we know that some of our clients talk about torture. And if we took their first narrative to us, and their second narrative, and their third one, we would describe them as torture victims. If we take their fifth, sixth encounter, we might realize that actually they're torture victims who were sexually violated as well, or as that was the form of the torture treatment. So, how do we get more clarity on sexual violence in what are considered torture settings, in torture contexts, in detention? When we screened South Sudanese men in 2017, we screened 450 men. Nearly half of them had spent some time in detention in South Sudan. And that seems to be one of the big locuses of sexual violence under the rubric of torture. I'm not saying that all of those 45% had suffered sexual violence, but they had all been in those detention settings where there's a very high risk of that happening. So let me close there in terms of giving you some of the reasoning behind the theme that we have for the next 3 days, and expressing my own hope and our hope as Refugee Law Project that we can arrive at a clearer understanding of when is torture actually sexual violence, so that we count it better and we include it in our discussions of sexual violence. And yes, let me stop there, but I would like to invite Ken Clearwater as a co-founder of this institute back in 2012. Arrived the day before from New Zealand, day before. So he's still jet lagged probably. But he's also brought with him a gift from one of the participants in the South-South Institute in New Zealand. And I've asked him if he would mind sharing that with us. Thank you, Ken.
Thanks, Chris. So one of the men who was a survivor, an Indigenous man from New Zealand, Māori, and he has asked if I could present this gift to Chris for the Refugee Law Project to go on their wall. And what it says is, He aha te mea nui o te ao, he tanata, which in the language of the Māori people of New Zealand says, What are the most important things in the world? And I will tell you, it is people, tis people, tis people. In the Māori creation story that has been passed down from generation to generation, Papa Tuanuku, Earth Mother, and Rangi Nui, Sky Father, was separated by the sun Tāne Mahuta, the Māori atua of the forest. And in this contemporary Māori artwork captures the very moment when light flooded onto humanity for the first time. Each curl represents generation after generation of humankind born into the world of light. With those numerous layers, people are male and female victims of sexual abuse and violence, boys and girls, men and women. And amongst the multitudes of people suffering in silent pain, but behold, a new dawn is breaking through, where victims are coming out into the light and being listened to and helped. Societies and governments worldwide are taking notice and actions. In the centre is New Zealand, Aotearoa, and its symbolism of the silver fern, a sign of peace, that our country lies at the forefront, where warriors, natural disasters, strikes, and other countries, ordinary New Zealanders get involved. What is the most precious thing in the world? It is people. So on behalf of Lewis and on behalf of the people and survivors of New Zealand, I'd like to present this piece of work to Chris Dolan from the Refugee Law Centre.
Thank you very, very much. And it's been a very enriching and appetizing presentation if you followed it. If you didn't follow it, no problem. The appetizer will be moving around still. There will be refresher phases in the course of our discussion. But just to highlight two things, if you listened to the agenda setting by Dr. Chris, you noticed that one of the things that was very clear is the need for us to begin to unpack, understand the various forms of sexual violence. And that is very important, because it then will inform or will let us know whether we are actually intervening correctly or not, whether we're missing certain points or we are hitting the right spots that we should be hitting. But clearly it means that we need to begin to understand and be honest whether we really know the various forms of sexual violence. And of course, you know, the big question of, do we really know the big picture? You know, and I think Chris Dolan has offered us a very nuanced history of the South to South Institute, emerging from this very room where we are today, where we began confronting a very long conversation. And that history was not like the one I started when I was in prehistory, or who discovered Lake Victoria. No. I think we have begun to see how, you know, exclusions are very, very fundamental in a discourse, in practice, and why confronting that is important. And of course, going to the end, and we're looking at sexual violence versus sexual abuse. They look similar, but it's important for us to keep checking on some of these. And of course, consequently, in New Zealand, looking at systematic racism, you know, versus institutionalized abuse. So you can see that there's a build-up of momentum, of discussions, of learning. And now we are here, bridging the divide between sexual violence and torture, actually, and beginning to see what is hidden somewhere, you know, in the discourse around torture that should actually be sexual violence, and why we are taking long to even make certain gains that we should have made some time ago. So I want to say that we have 2 minutes to the very end of this session, and shortly we'll have a tea break, and after the tea break we shall have a group photo session. But also, if you're having any burning question, by default, you know, opening remarks, agenda setting, don't have questions except concerns. But we will have enough time during plenary for you to be able to ask some of the questions that Dr. Chris Dolan may have, you know, tickled down in your own work and in your own field. But mine is to hope that this institute, like Dr. Chris said, that journalism, good journalism, can actually change the narrative and can open eyes on many things, you know. I also want to say that this institute can actually change the narrative and open eyes on sexual violence, and that is my hope for the day. I invite you to give a round of applause to this distinguished panel. And also to recognize that the Office of the High Commission of Human Rights is in the room. You're very much welcome. And let me take you back to our day manager to lead us to the next session. Clap for me to keep the time.
Thank you. We have another person doing documentation, Tina Smollett from AFPTV. So if you see her moving around, please don't be scared. She's one of the persons who is doing the documentation. Let's see you work from the back. Yes, that's her. For the washroom, if you're taking the left-hand side, just keep left. Through to the reception, keep left. The gents is first and the ladies after. If you take the right-hand side, still keep right. Through the dining, to the right. We will go out for the photo before the tea. And also those who have not registered, check in behind there, the desk. Let me see Joanne raise up her hand, she's in charge of that desk. And also people's name tags. Our tea will be set outside, so before that, let's go out for the photo. Thank you.